Pigs are flying, hell's frozen over, and a MAC team is leaving the MAC. Northern Illinois made it official a few weeks ago and announced that they would be joining the Mountain West as a football-only member for the 2026 season. Now, this isn't the first time that the MAC has lost teams to other conferences, and it's definitely not the first time Northern Illinois is at a tryst out west. But it does represent something of importance for the conference. It isn't safe anymore. Northern Illinois was far and away the most geographically isolated member of the conference, especially with its re-addition of UMass looming on the horizon. But with schools like Toledo and Buffalo primed to make jumps to another conference if they come looking, the conference isn't anywhere near as impervious to realignment woes as it once seemed. So what does the MAC do? Should it expand? If it should, will it? And if it does choose to expand, who should they target? Well, as for whether or not they should expand, the MAC's current TV contract has them placed near the bottom of the group of 5 in terms of television revenue, on a deal that splits games between midweek action games on ESPN and other games on CBS. According to On3, the ESPN part of that deal is reportedly worth $8 million, or around $600,000 per school. That's about $100,000 more than the Conference USA, who averages $400,000 to $500,000. But those numbers factor in schools like Northern Illinois, who is exiting, and schools like Toledo, Ohio, and Buffalo, who could very well be next. So as for whether or not the MAC should expand, it'll come down to whether or not a new member is additive or not, in order to help the media package stay ahead of Conference USA's. My guess is, with the right members, that answer is yes. Will they? Also probably yes, because it looks like they could use more schools. That only leaves one question. Who? I've accumulated 14 total schools that I think make sense for the MAC to pursue in expansion talks, and ranked them based on a total final score, which I'll talk about later. Obviously, I'll get this out there right now. This is my opinion, and I'm no mathematician. There are most definitely flaws in both my selection of schools and the methodology for which I rank them, but this group was selected off the top of my head, based on a few factors. To start, I have proximity to the nearest MAC school. Some conferences may be able to get away with having members far-flung all over the continental United States, but the MAC might as well be a glorified FCS conference, and we love them for it. But a part of that is that there just isn't that much money for long travels and airfare. That's part of the reason why NIU, as the westernmost member, decided to leave. Yearly trips to Buffalo and UMass on an already shoestring budget didn't make sense, and the only thing that makes longer travel in the Mountain West feasible is the extra money that'll come with it. This could result in the MAC changing more from a Great Lakes-focused conference to one more focused on the Northeast. The next factor I have is probably the most important, the athletics budget. In college sports, it's all about the cream. Cash rules everything around me. Obviously, moving from one conference to another almost always comes with a pay bump in that department, but the amount that you're starting with is also a huge factor in being admitted to a new conference, especially if you're moving up from the FCS. Ask Delaware and Missouri State. After that, I'm focusing on stadium size. Now, stadium size isn't the most important factor in a school joining the MAC, considering that the largest stadium in the conference is Akron's InfoCision Stadium at just 30,000, and the smallest will be UMass's McGurk Stadium at 17,000. But a lot of programs, especially in the FCS, have smaller stadiums that would need to be expanded to meet their peers in the MAC. And if a stadium seats only, say, 3,000 people, it might be a hard pass on their program joining the conference. After stadium size is win percentage since 2010. I chose 2010 because it's a fairly easy year to remember, and a lot of a program's standing is built in 15 years. I chose not to weigh points based on postseason success here either, because most teams here haven't really made a lot of noise in the postseason, but also because that tends to compound postseason success to an unbelievable degree. Losing in the semifinals shouldn't cause a team to balloon in prestige over a school that lost in the quarterfinals, like my previous rankings sometimes showed. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's look at the schools I chose, and we'll start with the schools that I didn't. There are a few former MAC schools that make sense immediately. Marshall spent some time in the MAC, as did Temple, but both of these programs are in conferences that have standings higher than the MAC does right now, which would make it very difficult to convince those schools to leave their current standing to join the MAC. So I'm not including any school in the American or Sun Belt conferences in this list. I mean, I guess the MAC could call just to be sure, but they'd probably be laughed out of the phone call. I'm also including UConn and Liberty on the list of do not call schools. UConn is clearly aiming towards a spot in either the ACC or the Big 12, and if memory serves me right, They turned down offers from both the Conference USA and the Pac-12 to be football-only members. It's all or nothing with the Huskies, and their basketball program would gain nothing from leaving the Big East just to join the lowly MAC. Liberty's in the same boat, focusing on joining the American or potentially the ACC, however much of a long shot that might be. As for FCS teams, the top group of schools people are going to ask for are the Dakota schools. For me, these schools legitimately make more money and have more success staying in the FCS Missouri Valley than they would moving up to, I think, any conference at the FBS level. That, and with the impending addition of Northern Illinois, the Mountain West makes clear sense for a conference to join geographically to fill in that Midwestern gap. If they're going to move up at all, which they're likely not, the MAC wouldn't even be on their radar. For the FBS, that leaves 4 schools, 2 of which aren't even FBS yet, and all of whom are members of Conference USA, the only conference in the MAC's poachability range: Western Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, Missouri State, and Delaware. Western Kentucky is the top name on MAC expansion boards for a reason. Even with Northern Illinois' departure making the western edge of the conference drier, the Hilltoppers have been a clear fit for the conference from the get-go. They're a little far away from Ball State at 249 miles, but have a solid operating athletics budget of over $40 million. At 22,000 seats, their stadium is cozy but not too small for other MAC schools' standards. They've also won 57% of their games since 2010, making them one of the most successful schools on this list. Middle Tennessee State, WKU's rival, is mentioned as a travel partner for the Hilltoppers despite being 342 miles away from Ball State. But WKU and MTSU have a deep rivalry with each other, making them tied to the hip. The Blue Raiders have the biggest athletics budget out of anyone we will look at in this video, and also have the largest stadium at nearly 31,000 seats. But their success on the field has been lacking recently, leaving them with just a 48% win percentage since 2010. Next up is the furthest school we'll be looking at, Missouri State. The FCS move-ups are 438 miles away from Ball State and have the smallest operating athletics budget out of all the FBS schools we will look at with $37 million. They've also been the least successful on the football field since 2010 with just a 38% win percentage. The last FBS school is Delaware. The Blue Hens have a $37.5 million athletics operating budget to go along with a 23,000 capacity stadium that's currently under renovation and a 59% win percentage, albeit at the FCS level, since 2010. They will also be fairly close to UMass at under 300 miles away. But this is it. These are your FBS options for MAC expansion. Let's look into some FCS options, even if these options aren't necessarily all that attractive at the current moment. If the MAC is going east with the re-addition of UMass, it's fair to see who else fits in that geographic range, starting with the Rhode Island Rams. The Rams are 116 miles away from Amherst, making them one of the closest in proximity schools we'll be looking at today. Despite being an FCS team, their athletics department operates at a budget of over $35.5 million a year, which isn't too bad, but their football team has been a problem. Recently rebuilding in the Colonial Athletic Conference, the Rams play in a 6,500 capacity stadium and have a winning percentage of just 36% since 2010. Another Eastern school they could look into is New Hampshire. The Wildcats have been an underrated FCS team for a while, with a 63% win percentage since 2010 and a larger-than-average Northeastern football stadium of 11,000 seats. Their athletics budget is $34.5 million a year, and at 132 miles away from UMass, they aren't too far out of the way. Helping to bridge the Pennsylvania-sized gap between Kent State and Buffalo could be the Duquesne Dukes, at just 101 miles away from Kent State. Despite having a win percentage of 63%, the Dukes are not a football school and fit their $24 million athletics budget into a stadium that's barely over 2,000 capacity with no hope of building another on-campus stadium. Now, some folks will clamor for 2 schools in the state of Ohio to appease travel issues: Dayton and Youngstown State. And on paper, these schools look like great additions. Dayton is only 42 miles away from Oxford and has a really high athletics budget of $36 million per year. They're also not terrible at the football they play, with an 11,000 capacity stadium playing host to a 64% winning percentage. The problem with Dayton is obvious. They're a Pioneer League school, meaning they don't offer scholarships to their players. On top of that, the Atlantic 10, where their basketball team plays, is a step above the MAC. The Penguins don't have quite the same issues, being a Missouri Valley program in football and a Horizon League school in other sports, but they suffer in other areas. Their $20 million athletics budget is on the lower end of other schools on this list, and despite having a stadium that sits over 20,000 spectators in line to watch nearly 500 football, the Penguins suffer from the same cardinal sin that Dayton also does. They'd be just another Ohio school in a conference that already has 6 Ohio members. The MAC shouldn't look at either of these schools at all if they want to have a successful expansion. So we move back east, this time to the Great Danes of Albany in New York. Albany would give the MAC 2 SUNY institutions on either side of the state, with Albany being just 100 flat miles away from Amherst. That's about where the positives end for Albany, though, with a $27 million operating budget, a small stadium at 8,500 seats, and a 46% win percentage since 2010. Indiana State is another school that makes sense on paper until you look at the details. The Sycamores are 141 miles away from Ball State, but have the smallest athletics budget out of any school we're looking at with just over $18 million. Their famously awkward stadium seats under 13,000 fans, and at a 38% win percentage, there won't be many fans in those seats anyway. They're a good addition in other ways, like being a major state institution, but they don't stand out as much as I thought they would. The same can't be said for Illinois State. The Redbirds from Normal could get the conference back into the state of Illinois at just 222 miles away from Ball State, and a $30 million athletics budget isn't bad either. Their stadium seats 13,400 fans, and there are plans for expansion that get brought up every once in a while. At a 60% win percentage, they'd make a good addition too, but with their distance from the rest of the conference, they likely only make sense as a package deal with another school or schools, like Western Kentucky or Middle Tennessee. Staying in Illinois, we arrive at Southern Illinois. The Salukis play in a pretty big FCS stadium at 15,000 capacity, but are 328 miles away from Ball State, have an athletics budget of under $19 million, and have only won 46% of their games since 2010. They don't move the needle much. This last school is in the same boat as a school they'd only add with Western Kentucky, and that's Eastern Kentucky. The Colonels are a good football program with a 54% win percentage and a 20,000 capacity stadium. At 145 miles away from Miami of Ohio, they're also a lot closer than some of the other schools on this list would be to the heart of the conference. But with just a $20 million athletics budget, they sit behind most of the other schools on this list. So now let's look at our formula. To determine my MACtion score, or how good of an addition I think a school is for the MAC, I combine scores for proximity, budget, stadium size, and success. To determine the proximity score, I had to get a little creative. As of right now, the distance between Northern Illinois and Buffalo, or the longest stretch between members in 2024, is about 600 miles. So for the proximity score, I took that 600 miles minus how far away that school was from their closest member, and then divided the result by 10. I realize this is a really arbitrary way of determining how geographically desirable a school is, so I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on what I should have used instead. Next is the budget score. For that, I took the team's operating athletics budget and divided it by 100,000 to give me a number on the range of the other numbers I used in this list. For the stadium size score, I just took the amount of seats divided by 1,000, and for the success score, I multiplied the team's win percentage by 100 to get a round-ish number for how many games they'd win out of 100. I then added, not multiplied, each of the scores together to reach the final max score, which is another area I could have gone wrong. But here are the results I got. Some things are surprising, some things aren't. For one, Western Kentucky and Middle Tennessee State are far and away the two best options for admission into the MAC, and Dayton's A10 athletics budget overinflates their would-be potential into a third-place finish. Delaware places fourth, which also makes sense, but after that, things get weird. New Hampshire becomes the most attractive FCS option with 462 points, with Rhode Island right on their heels with 447 points, which places them above Missouri State at 441 points. After that, it's Illinois State, Albany, Duquesne, despite their tiny stadium, Eastern Kentucky, Youngstown State, and Indiana State and SIU bringing up the rear. There are a few things I straight up disagree with about my findings. For one, EKU being the fourth least desirable out of this list doesn't make any sense to me. I know it's doing it, and it's their athletics budget of just $20 million. Despite that, the Colonels seem to do more with less, have a very faithful fan base that would surely explode with MAC membership, especially if the Hilltoppers and Raiders come with them. I also disagree with Duquesne's high rank. That stadium seats 2,200 people, man. That's absolutely and inexcusably minuscule. I don't care how many games you win in it. So what did we find? Well, for starters, aside from Western Kentucky and Middle Tennessee State, there aren't many options for MAC expansion that stand out above the rest of the crowd. The clearest and best option is Delaware, and if you have to delve into the FCS ranks, which they hope they don't, New Hampshire and Eastern Kentucky are probably their best bets. But after that, it gets pretty muddled, and it probably doesn't matter as much who you choose between Rhode Island or Illinois State or Albany. We also found that Indiana State absolutely needs to step their game up. But we also found, like the last time I tried to do something like this, that it's really hard to come up with a formula or a theory to precisely target the best schools for expansion, especially for the MAC. There's no magic formula that'll tell you exactly who the conference should pinpoint to keep them afloat, and if there is, it certainly isn't obvious. And that's if the MAC decides it's important at all to expand. Northern Illinois' departure, while worrying, doesn't sound the death knell for the MAC. Yet. UMass's return brings them right back to around 12. But the Huskies leaving does open the door for other schools like Toledo, who was approached by the Mountain West with the same deal the Huskies took, or Buffalo, who was in the final rounds of the American Conference expansion talks a few years ago, to finally make the decision to leave the MAC behind. And if that happens, it's more likely the MAC sinks to FCS than stays as an FBS conference. But what do you guys think? Should the MAC expand? And if they do, who should they target to expand? Was my formula right? What would you change to make it more accurate to what you think matters to conferences? As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.